Welcome to Tech Focus Botcast, powered by Smartbots, where we explore the exciting world of technology, innovation, and future of AI. I'm Mansa, your host, and today we have two exceptional guests with us. Let's get started with our first guest, Sid Shankar, a visionary entrepreneur, product leader, and a strategic thinker. Sid is currently working on stealth ventures in the field of generative AI. Sid, can you please share more about your remarkable career and how you entered the world of data, AI, and product management?
Thank you, Manasa. It's a very, very flattering introduction, I must say. I am Sid. Nice to meet you all. Very excited to be on this podcast with you. I did my undergrad at IIT Madras, computer science and engineering. After that, went to McKinsey, did management consulting for a few years in our Mumbai office. Came to the US for business school at Wharton, interned at Google as a product manager, and then did some more time in McKinsey in the Bay Area. I really loved California. I didn't really like the East Coast too much. I felt I was really homesick. It was nice to kind of meet up with some long lost family members, two uncles that I didn't even know existed that I just bumped into in San Jose, which is often the case, I think, with the diaspora. And then at some point in time, we essentially we got pregnant, and my wife just told me to choose between her and McKinsey. She said I can't have both, and so that's the ultimatum. After which I decided to essentially listen to what she said, which was I think a very prescient choice at the time, and start working in gaming. Gaming has been a lifelong passion of mine. I've been gaming since the time I can remember. Cricket 97 was a game that I bought in I'm trying to Swapnalope complex at like in Hyderabad when I got my first computer. Still remember walking into that computer store and walking out with that disc. So it was really nice to go and work for EA for a while. Worked on games like FIFA, Need for Speed, Battlefield, and more, which have defined my childhood. And so that's when I got back into product, data, and AI. And gaming for a while. I was then at Skills, which is another mobile esports company, right after EA, and then I really was bitten by the entrepreneurship bug. We had a very nice stint last year at this company called DVX Ventures, where I worked on building a coffee shop app for every coffee shop that's not Starbucks. So think about it as the same experience as a Starbucks experience, but for the coffee shop around the corner. Amazing experience. Really had a good time. Disastrous fundraising environment and macroeconomic business environment last year. So all that came crashing down in December. And then that's when I reconnected with another classmate of mine from undergrad, Chaitanya, who got his PhD at MIT and works in the field of operations. And he's now a professor at Kellogg on sabbatical currently at NUS. So he and I have literally, we started a podcast on AI. And since then, we discovered some very interesting problems in the field of generative AI, particularly around hallucinations. And we've been working on some cool things there. So we live in the Bay Area. We have two kids, a 6-year old and a 2-year old, to keep us very, very busy.
Interesting, and thank you, Sid, for that insightful introduction. Now, shifting focus to our second guest, JP, could you please tell our audience more about your role at Smartboards and your extensive experience in tech and AI industry?
Hello, all. Thanks, Mansa, for having me. And Sid and I went to the same college. I'm like, I think, 1, 2 years senior to Sid. And then later, my career has been primarily into data science and algorithms. I worked in the space of natural language processing back in 2006 to 9 when AI was not that famous. And later, from 2013 onwards, I've been into the entrepreneurship journey. Have started. This is my third company. For the past few years, I have been helping enterprises build and deploy conversational AI assistants. We call them chat and voice bots. Typically, I've been helping enterprises, large enterprises, deploy the solutions. And for the past 1 year, I've been working in the most exciting and the most popular topic, not just in tech, but across industries, the generative AI and large language models. So, and about my profession, and actually, I would say I'm a solution architect by passion. I love building products. And for the past 2 years, I've been extensively investing my time in developing a conversational AI studio that helps enterprises quickly deploy the chat and voice bots in a secure manner. So that's about me.
Excellent, JP. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the core discussion. I'd like to pass the torch to you and over to you, JP.
Thank you, Mansa, for setting this up. Yeah, so before we deep dive into the tech aspects of this generative AI and large language models, the one question which always comes to my mind and most of the people especially in the enterprises, keep asking whether this is a hype. The other point of view I also hear is whether there's an there's a overhype on one side, and the other side, is it perhaps underhyped? What is your view, Sid? What do you think is the direction we are heading in the generative AI landscape?
Yeah, great question, JP. I think both of those statements are true. Fundamentally, I think if you look at what generative AI represents, I believe it's a fundamentally transformational piece of technology, the likes of which I think the last time we saw this was with smartphones in 2007, and before that with the internet in the late 90s. I think this is one of those once in a few decades kinds of revolutions that happens that fundamentally reshapes how society is organized. Because if you think back in AI, right, if you go back, and we have an episode on this in case anyone wants to check it out, there's the journey has been one where the core algorithms that drive generative AI are not new. Neural networks were invented in the 1960s and 1970s. They've been around for a very long time. What's changed is the two things. I think one is the amount of data that's available for neural networks to crunch and like essentially train themselves on. And second is the type of hardware that they have access to that makes them do things much faster than we ever thought possible. So when you combine this core algorithm that has gotten enough time to mature and get to a very, very good stage over the last 50 years, with data explosion in the last couple of decades, and with hardware that is newer than ever before, suddenly are in a position where it's making a difference. I think it's going to transform every single industry that we are living in right now in the next 20 years. I think if you're whoever's watching this, if you're not learning about generative AI today, you should be. It's very, very important, very crucial. Having said that, I think absolutely, like with any new technology, there is definitely a hype cycle going on right now. Right, there is definitely a sense that there's a gold rush. Everyone's like rushing towards it, saying, "Oh my God, this is cool! I just need to learn about this and kind of make sure that I don't fall behind." It happened early. We're also, I think, just coming off of what happened with crypto and Web3, where there was a massive hype cycle, and then after the macroeconomic changes last year, people are feeling, I think, very despondent and a little kind of underwhelmed with what happened. And so there's a very natural tendency to look at the next thing that comes along as this is going to be exactly like what happened to Web3. There again, I think it's fundamentally a different type of technology. And therefore, I think it's different in the sense that Web3 as a technology, again, by itself is really, really amazing. The problem was it was being used for one particular use case, which is cryptocurrency, where the need was not necessarily as great as some people might have thought. That again, if you go back in history, there's an episode on this in our podcast that people can check out. But there is this idea that after the financial crisis, there was a lot of distrust in the financial system, and that's where essentially the whole idea of crypto was born. And so when you saw that and you saw distrust in financial institutions, in the election system after the elections in the United States over the last couple of cycles, you have a lot of like anti-establishment feelings in the population, which I think funneled a lot of the excitement about Web3. And that's why when the kind of the hype collapsed, it was very clear that it was not based on the underlying tech, it was based on something else. With generative AI, I think that's the difference, right? There's definitely a hype cycle. I think this is going to die down in the next couple of years, just like what happened with the internet. There was a time when we were in 1998 and everybody was like just coming up with a random company saying, whatever I'm doing offline, we'll just do it online. Let's just buy food on the internet. Let's buy vegetables on the internet, whatever else, right? There was a company for everything. But if you look at over time, has the internet changed our lives fundamentally? Absolutely. But did it change our lives in the way that we thought about it in 1997? I don't think so. And the same thing in 2007 as well with the smartphone. The first few apps that came, when they said, okay, you have the GPS and you have the internet, what can you do? The first apps just did some very gimmicky stuff like, okay, let me look at all the restaurants that are close to me right now. That was an app that literally showed you restaurants, coffee shops, hospitals, whatever else. Like that was one of the apps that did that. It was called Around Me. But nobody forecasted that Uber would be possible because of something like the smartphone. So I feel like really that's why I feel like your question is a very interesting one. Both statements are true. There is definitely a hype cycle, and it's also not hyped up enough. Over the next 10 years, I think we're going to see this transform our lives in very interesting ways. But once the 2 year cycle dies down, I think we'll be in a better shape.
What I hear is like in 2 years, we'll see that there'll be more of the hype coming down, but the level will be much higher than what we are standing today. And there will be more innovations like Uber on basis of this technology that would come up.
Yeah, exactly. And it's impossible to predict those. My point is like that's the reason why I think it's important for people to understand the tech better. If you were sitting in 2007 in that room where Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, very, very few of us could have predicted Uber from that point in time, or DoorDash, right? Or any of these apps that we now take for granted. And yet all of those apps were impossible without the iPhone or without the smartphone. And my point is like that's exactly the moment we're living in, the first thing you think of right now, for example, generative AI, okay, everyone's saying let's use it for chatbots. That is like the most obvious use case, and it's a very first order effect. I think when you get to the second and the third order use cases for generative AI, we're going to really see some transformation happening.
Great. So, talking about the enterprises who are trying out the applications on top of LLMs, I'm sure you must be interacting with few of them. What do you hear as the most pressing challenge they face today? Is it in terms of the security, or they are afraid that this is a new technology? Are they worried about the legal complexities around this large language models? What exactly is bothering them?
Yeah, absolutely, very fascinating topic, right? So if you think about it, like every CEO is now under the hammer to like come up with a generative AI strategy. That's like the first thing. Every investor, every kind of earnings call that you have, everyone's going to ask you, "Hey, like, what is your generative AI strategy?" If you don't have an answer, that's not acceptable right now. It's like the next new kid on the block. You have to have an answer. So what does the CEO do? Turns around to the CIO and say, "Hey, CIO, can you now like give me a very clear generative AI strategy that I can then tell to my investors the next time?" So now CIO is like getting an input from the CEO on, okay, I need to come up with a Gen AI strategy. And then you have somebody in legal and compliance saying we have to be really, really particular about data and privacy and every other regulation that matters, which is a serious issue. You have the CISO coming and telling the CIO security is going to be a massive challenge. Make sure that we don't leak information inappropriately. And then within the CIO org itself, you have this problem of hallucination, which, for those of you that may not know, LLMs basically can lie. They make up stuff all the time. They might say stuff that's either factually inaccurate or they give you answers that are irrelevant to the question being asked. So, for example, if I ask the question, what is the capital of the United States? An LLM might just say Paris is the capital, or it might say George Washington was the first president of the United States. So, the first case, if it says Paris is the capital, that's just incorrect. And in the second case, George Washington was the first president, it's irrelevant. It's factually correct, but completely irrelevant to the question being asked. So, if you combine all of these, right, there is the legal and compliance problems, there is security problems, there is data privacy issues, and then there's hallucination, which is the fundamental reputational damage that an LLM can do. Imagine if you use a chatbot for something and then that gives you wrong information about the company's product and services. Someone's just going to take a screenshot of that, post it on Twitter, and before you know it, like you've become a meme for the rest of the world to now laugh at. And even worse, it could affect like future customers that might be interested in procuring your products and services. So I think there is a huge set of issues that are coming on across the board, and all of them I think are going to get better over time. It's one of those things where just like when cloud came up 10 years ago, everybody was like, this is the most insecure thing ever. How can I ever imagine a world where my workloads are sitting in some other cloud? I'm going to use my own data center. That was a accepted norm in the 2010s. To now we live in a world where like the public cloud is like fairly commonplace, right? So I think it's a question of these things will just take time. But right now the biggest problems I see are all the ones you mentioned: security, data privacy, legal compliance, and also hallucinations, which essentially make the problem seem bigger than it is.
The analogy you took about data centers a few years back, and now similar threat we are facing or the enterprises are facing. And I buy the point that you mentioned. Maybe very soon enterprises will be familiar with this technology and they'll be willing to share their data. But the hallucination I see is a much bigger problem because the brand is at stake. And how do you think, first of all, are there any metrics that, say, you or any of the data science in the data science world, are people working on any of the metrics? So, because if you can't measure, you can't fix. So, what is your take on the hallucination and how you can measure hallucination?
Yeah, so if you break that down, if you think about hallucinations, right? So there are, if you think about use cases and like how hallucinations manifest, in some use cases, the hallucination is coming from a place where you don't really have any kind of source data that you can compare it against. So, for instance, if you're asking me to generate a poem in the style of Rabindranath Tagore, and I want that poem to be about my pet dog, then the hallucination there is it maybe is either not about my pet dog or it's not in the style of Rabindranath Tagore for some reason. Those are the types of hallucinations that you have. But the thing is, because this is fundamentally creative expression, it is very hard for me to say that something is not hallucinated by comparing it to something. It just seems like something's not right. Maybe it generates a Shakespearean like poem instead of a Rabindranath Tagore type poem. And instead of making it about my dog, it makes it about my cat. Those kind of hallucinations, like, yeah, you can like dog versus cat, you can go and see, okay, maybe the subject matter was the wrong one. But the style thing is such a subjective kind of idea. It's going to be hard for somebody to go and like validate this against like some known source. It's more like a gut feel. A human can look at it and say, this is not something that is giving me the desired output. That's one type of hallucination where the kind of use case is very creative. Then we come to this other entire set of use cases where the output is very factual. So let's say you're asking for like a product description and you have a product catalog. It's very easy for you to say, hey, is this answer that I got from the LLM agreeing with what's in the product catalog, or is it fundamentally different from what's there? And that's something that you can easily validate, and you can establish without any ambiguity what the ground truth is, and therefore what the amount of hallucination is. So the way when we think about measuring hallucination, we think about two things. We think about what we call a truth score, which is what percentage of the output was factually correct. So let's say you have a paragraph, and within the paragraph, you have multiple sentences, and each sentence has a different set of facts that underlie what the paragraph is. And so each fact then becomes something that you can validate with either it's true or false. And then you can come up with a composite score for the entire paragraph on what is the overall truth score. That's one dimension. Second dimension would be a relevance score. So for the question being asked and the answer being provided, is every sentence really relevant to the question being asked? And so you can provide a relevance score. So you can think about these two dimensions, right? A truth score and a relevance score that we would then score any of these outputs on. And then if something is in, let's say, above a truth threshold of 85% and above a relevance threshold of, let's say, 75%, you say the answer is good enough. And if it's below that threshold, you say, hey, this is not good enough. Either go generate it again, or if you repeat this multiple times and nothing happens, send it to a human to actually create the answer.
That's a really insightful answer. Has a lot of points. The truth score and relevance score are, if you consider that as the two factors to evaluate hallucination, if you can compare it with the confusion matrix with the traditional AI models, looks like 1 year down the line, we'll have a hallucination clearly scoped out or measured using truth score and relevance score. And in terms of the way enterprises are going to read this course, right? So 1 year down the line, imagine there are a lot of applications coming up. And do you think the enterprises will be okay to live with a score which is like not 100%? Because one fear I hear from enterprises is if the truth score is not 100%, no, we can't proceed. What is your take? What do you think will be, how will it evolve in 1 year down the line?
Yeah, I think it totally depends on the use case, right? So I think there are certain applications, even for enterprises, where you don't need 100% truth in every situation. So what is the cost, or let's say differently, what is the impact of a hallucinating LLM? So if you think about a field like healthcare or financial services, absolutely agree with you. There you need 100%, you need guarantees. Otherwise, people have poor health outcomes, or in financial services, people have negative financial outcomes. But if you look at more harmless applications or relatively harmless applications, someone doing something on TikTok, where if I hallucinate and I give you some text, at the worst, like it's funny and it's kind of like not necessarily as it maybe for my marketing team putting stuff out, the hallucination might even lead to, like, in a bizarre way, a virality that happens because of the fact that it hallucinated, and I get notoriety because something crazy happened that was unexpected, but the use case didn't really come back to bite me in a very fundamental way. So I think certain applications, certain industries where the downside of a hallucination is very, very high, absolutely, I think enterprises will be looking for certainty, and that's what we are also banking on when we think about what we're doing in our startup. We think this is going to become a very key issue, but there are lots of use cases, I think, even in enterprises where that will not be the case.
I'm 100% sure that hallucination is going to be the next big topic this year. And it has already been the major topic of concern primarily, and maybe the topic of discussion next year. And I'm sure that the work that you're doing will help a lot of enterprises in solving this hallucination and related problems.
Yeah, and just to kind of touch on that, right? The thing is, hallucinations are actually a feature. So if you go back to the foundations of what an LLM is, if you an LLM that fundamentally doesn't hallucinate is no different from a table lookup. It's just like going in and fetching something that it knows in advance. The thing that makes LLMs exciting is the fact that they deviate from the source material. If they didn't deviate, it wouldn't be exciting. The fact that it deviates is what makes it cool. But now you have this very interesting problem where if the deviation is too much from the source material, we now consider it to be a hallucination. We think, oh, this is not effective for the kind of problem that we're trying to solve. So this fascinating thing where you can't really fundamentally, it's like the feature of the platform that makes it what it is. So you can't take it away, but you have to find mechanisms to fix it after the fact, which is what I think makes this a very particularly exciting problem, unlike many others, where many times when you have a problem in any kind of computer science system, it's very clear that the problem itself is a problem. But here, this is one of those rare cases where the problem is actually a good thing, as long as it's happening within a certain like limited blast radius. The issue is when it gets out of control that we see the issue. So I think it makes it particularly more fascinating and more interesting as a problem space because of that dynamic.
That's a good analogy. I liked it. And do you see that going forward, there'll be multiple LLMs working hand in hand to solve one problem? Today, if you take ChatGPT for example, it is one large model serving all the users across the world with the regular information on a chat interface. Going forward, do you see that, say, applications will come out where there will be, say, 10 underlying models together working hand in hand to solve one business problem? Do you see that coming in the next 1 year?
Absolutely. I mean, timeline is something that we can think about, but like the way I see the future, I think the future is going to be fundamentally multi-model and multimodal. And so what that means is that you're going to have in any given situation, you're going to use a combination of different models, not just a single model, because every model has its own characteristics and things that it does well, something that it does poorly. So the enterprises will not be satisfied with just using one single third-party provider for all their use cases. I think you're going to have a combination of different models that are used. And in addition to it, I think it's going to be multimodal, right? So you're going to have text, images, video, audio, different types of modalities of these generative models that are going to come out that all have to work harmoniously together. And the other thing that you mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is we actually think the future is going to be dominated by small models, not by large models. And the reason for that is if you look at what a large model is, it needs, first of all, what's the large in a large language model? It needs a large amount of data to train itself. So the way ChatGPT did it is by getting access to a lot of the internet and to a lot of the biggest websites that allowed their data to be scraped. What you're going to see in the future is that's not going to be that easy. Most sources of data have now realized that they can't allow their data to be scraped. And so future versions, I think, of large language models might even get worse because you don't have access to that large amount of training data that is so precious for those models. And if anything, they might be trained on synthetic data that is generated by the LLMs itself. So imagine a world where ChatGPT v10 is trained by data created by ChatGPT v9. And the reason for that is there's no original data available. People have closed it off. Reddit has shut themselves off. There's a world maybe Wikipedia shuts themselves off. Every other like provider of information on the internet just realizes that data is gold, and they don't want some third-party provider of LLMs to essentially take their data and monetize it. And they say we're going to shut it down. So in that world, you now have a very interesting situation where we think the future is going to be dominated by small models where people own their own data and they train those models on that data, which also gives you better performance in terms of latency and in terms of cost. Because when you do inferences on small models, you don't need the same computing hardware as you do a large model. And the speed of output is also extremely fast compared to what happens in a large model. Now, the interesting thing, though, is in this scenario, if you think the future is going to be dominated by small models, one interesting property is small models tend to typically hallucinate more than large models. So, in some ways, you're going to cut stuck in this very interesting kind of trade off. You can use a large model that doesn't have access to a lot of source data, but will hallucinate possibly a little less, versus using a small model that's trained on very specific data that's relevant to you, but tends to hallucinate more. Both cases are problems because in the large model that doesn't have access to your source data, it might give you kind of outputs that are irrelevant because it doesn't have the context. And the small model, because by virtue of being small and because it hallucinates more, might also hallucinate for other reasons. So that's why I think this hallucination problem is going to be really fascinating as the future kind of plays out in this matter.
So talking about the large models, the larger than large models like Anthropic and GPT-4, there's a news just a couple of days back that AWS has invested in Anthropic. From an enterprise standpoint, what do you see? What benefits can enterprise get with this kind of action? So Microsoft has already invested heavily in OpenAI, and now AWS, though a little late in the race, has come in and then has invested in Anthropic. So from an enterprise standpoint, do you see that enterprises are going to get, cost advantage, price advantage, latency advantages? What is your take on this move which AWS did?
Yeah, I think if you step back and look at it from like the wider lens, right? There's basically three cloud providers that exist today. There's AWS, there's Azure, and there's Google GCP. Each one of them are taking a very different approach towards the LLM problem, and rightly so, because they all believe in a slightly different version of the future that kind of has them in a pole position. So if you look at let's go step by step, right? If you look at Microsoft, Azure has been around, I'd say, in terms of enterprises for the longest time. AWS is a relatively late entrant because even back in the days of 95 and 90s, you had Windows Server around for the longest time. So they had a very strong presence in enterprise. And so Microsoft's attitude towards this entire problem is we already have very good relationships with customers. We have phenomenal install bases. Let's figure out ways to give them value, and we understand customers' data inside out. So what we will give you is we'll give you the best of breed, which is let's say ChatGPT today, and we will allow you to use that in a secure environment by giving you guardrails around ensuring that your data never leaves your systems. That's Microsoft and OpenAI together with their offering. AWS has taken a very, very different approach. They've said, we are actually completely agnostic to what kind of LLM you use. We will provide a platform between SageMaker, Titan, and everything else they offer that allows you to use whatever LLM you choose. But as long as you're running it within AWS's ecosystem, we're fine with supporting anything that you have at your disposal. And now it's interesting. They're making an, I think, investment in Anthropic more from the standpoint of giving them an insurance policy against Microsoft and OpenAI. But fundamentally, AWS has not made any moves that tie them to specific LLMs as much as provide platforms that are generically supporting everything. That's the typical AWS stance that I've seen in the last few months. If you look at GCP, this is again very interesting. GCP takes a completely different stance. They say, unlike Microsoft, we've developed our own LLM. Unlike AWS, also we've developed our own LLM, which is what is internal to Google. We're not going to make that LLM run on extremely optimized hardware that we've built for custom built for that purpose. We're going to give you the best performance that you can get in this space. Now, our LLM may not necessarily be the best in the world, but the combination of LLM and hardware that we give you as GCP is like the Apple value in terms of Apple's phone and software being so tightly tied together that it gives you a very good experience. That's like what Google is doing now. So it's very, very fascinating to see these three. It's going to be interesting to find out which of these three kind of approaches wins over the next few years. But I think the fact that we have three completely different approaches to the same problem, I think is exciting for consumers. We have so much choice. It's going to be an interesting few years to figure out how this plays out.
Absolutely. So, the you mentioned about smaller models ruling the enterprise game in the next say 1-2 years. In that direction, if say that is what turns out to be the future, then maybe AWS would have an edge because it is now catering to or providing a platform where you can have host multiple foundation models. So talking about the small models, as of now, maybe you mentioned that small models hallucinate a lot, and there's another concept called fine tuning, which is again one of the keywords which is commonly used in Bay Area. If you go to any coffee shop, you'll hear these words: fine tuning, RAG, generative AI, hallucination. These have become common English vocabulary in the Bay Area, and not just Bay Area, everywhere around the world. So talking about fine tuning, what is your take on fine tuning from an enterprise standpoint? Do you think this is a viable strategy for enterprises working with smaller models, fine tuning them based on their data set? And say 1 year down the line, you see that most of the models are small, owned by the enterprises within their VPC and secure. Do you see that to be happening already, or what is your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think on your first point, yeah, if you don't use the word hallucination or fine tuning or RAG, I think your barista in the Bay Area will refuse to give you your coffee. So I think that's definitely true. I think the point you made around the small models being the future, I think is very, very spot on. The interesting thing there is the approaches that we have towards reducing hallucinations, right? There's a few different ones. If you think about the landscape. So if you break it down a little bit for, I think, for your listeners, there's three steps. There is the input that goes into the model, there's the model itself, and then there's the output that the model generates. So if you look at those three steps, the interventions that we have are in one of these three stages. Fine tuning is something that happens in the second stage, which is the model itself, where you go in and you change the weights on the model to kind of correspond to the specific data set that you are fine tuning that model on, to ensure that it is more customized to the data that you have. That's what fine tuning is. That's one approach. It's good. It's definitely better than not doing anything, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate hallucinations, and it still can create like artifacts for you, because at the end of the day, if you go back to the foundations, what is an LLM? An LLM fundamentally is a piece of tech that predicts the next word given the words that have come before it. So if I told you Mary had a little backpack, because this context is actually different, we're talking about Mary who's a student in school, and she's talking about the fact that her backpack is too small for the kind of big gift that she received on her birthday. But if you look at the way an LLM works, it just looks at statistics and probabilities. And it says the number of times I've seen Mary had a little in the past, the next word that was most common was lamb. So of course there's a little bit of randomness in there, but I'm going to, with a high degree of probability, insert the word lamb into it. That's what an LLM fundamentally is. And all generative AI is based on this fundamental idea of statistics, where you're predicting the next item based on what came before. So if you take that idea, what fine tuning does is it says, in my data set, maybe every time you see Mary had a little, it always says backpack and it doesn't say lamb. And so now you're telling the model, hey, give a higher weightage to backpack after you see Mary had a little, more than you give for lamb after Mary had a little. That's what fine tuning does. It's a good approach, but it doesn't eliminate the hallucination, because fundamentally, again, you're stuck with probabilities. That's the one kind of intervention, right? That you do at the model level. There's another intervention called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, that you do at the input level. It's another term that you hear in coffee shops here all the time. So what you do with RAG is you go and fetch context on the particular prompt. So let's say my question was something around, tell me about who is the greatest president the United States has ever had. Then it goes and fetches context from your sources of truth that are specific to that problem. Maybe it fetches you a list of US presidents. So that it doesn't give me the answer saying Shah Rukh Khan was the greatest president the United States has had. That will not happen, because the retrieval that you did before the prompt did not include Shah Rukh Khan. So there's a good chance that it's not going to give you a completely made up answer. But maybe it gave you the answer as George W. Bush, which I think for most people would be a terrible answer given that, unless if somebody is particularly politically minded. But my point is, you are limiting the amount of hallucinations that happen by essentially fetching some piece of context that you can bring to the problem. That's called RAG. But both RAG, and there's another approach called step-by-step reasoning, which is another thing that you use in a lot of mathematical applications. This is again at the prompt level, where you tell it, don't just give me the answer. Like, when you're in high school and your math teacher told you, I'll give you marking for steps and not just for the final answer. That's exactly what this is. You're telling the model, when you're trying to solve this long division problem, don't just tell me the quotient and the remainder. Show me the steps that you use to get to that answer. And it's funny how when you ask the model to do that, it does a much better job of like higher accuracy when it's asked to give you the steps. But just to kind of summarize, right? So at the input level, you have RAG and you have a step-by-step reasoning. At the model level, you have fine tuning. But the point is, none of these can guarantee the elimination of hallucinations, because they're not at the output level. The only way to guarantee that a hallucination is not happening is by looking at the output after it's been generated and then going and checking and making sure that nothing bad has happened. So whether you do fine tuning, whether you do RAG, whether you're doing step by step, you're not going to eliminate the problem, which is why we think it's a very fascinating area for a lot of research to go into.
Sure. So what we heard is fine tuning, RAG, step by step processing or chain of thoughts, and what else? Hallucination. These are the keywords which I heard from you today, and I'm sure most of the people are dealing with these words and the associated challenges. One, I mean, to conclude, I want to ask you about your suggestion to the enterprises for the next year in terms of their LLM strategy. What should be their overall strategy for adopting LLMs? I mean, you can summarize about whether they should depend on smaller models. Should they go for large models like Anthropic, GPT-4? What all investments? What is the right investment strategy? Maybe if you can summarize all this, keeping in mind an enterprise, we will conclude with this last question.
Yeah, absolutely. I spent a lot of time at McKinsey, so I'm very familiar with 2x2s. I feel like that's the best way to make any strategic decision. So I think high level, if you think about it, there's literally two dimensions, right? I think all enterprises should be thinking about. The first is, what is the impact of generative AI on that use case? That's one dimension. So is that making a massive difference? Is it a game changer? So I'll give you, like, for instance, if you're a bank and you see that using generative AI, I get these like physical mails all the time that come from my bank telling me to get a credit card and then get a car loan and whatever else. Those mails are horribly non-customized. They are the most generic pieces, because maybe there's somebody in the bank that has, like, 20 segments of people of their entire population, and they're just using that to kind of give these mass mails out. If you find that you personalize the email and you feel like, not the email, the physical mail, and you could cater it to my exact life situation that from my entire transaction history. I just bought a house, or I just bought a car, and I'm looking for whatever else, right? Something else happened. My direct deposit stopped coming because I changed jobs or something like that. Like, lots about my personal life based on my financial history. If you use that information to cater financial products that are specific to me, and go down to the segment of one, which is a holy grail of marketing, I think that would be very high on the impact dimension. So that would be the first dimension I'd ask enterprise to think about is what is the impact that generative AI can have on that use case. The second dimension is what is the criticality of not doing this? If you didn't do this, would it be something that would like bankrupt you in the next few years? And if that's the case, then again, the top right quadrant, right, of use cases where the impact of generative AI is extremely high and the kind of price of inaction is also very high, where it's not something that you can afford to be asleep at the wheel on, would then be the first set of use cases that I would be spending a lot of my time on in terms of thinking about how we intervene and put generative AI in. So that's the first step. Figure out what the use cases are that really matter. The second step is then to say, okay, now given that you have a set of priority use cases, how do you best decide to serve them? And here I think experimentation is the name of the game. Trying out a variety of models, small ones, large ones, open source ones, closed source ones, given some guardrails around things like security, reliability, hallucinations, these kinds of topics that we spoke about, will I think help enterprises get a better sense of like which ones do better for what use case. So use cases first, models next, and then third, I think this is the hardest part is the change management, right? We often like put this down to the last thing, but at the end of the day, you have humans that are doing some things in their day-to-day job. I feel the biggest impact of generative AI has been that earlier the difference between an individual contributor and a manager was that you were good at what you did as an IC, and then you became a manager and you had to like manage other people who were doing it. Gen AI means that every single human on earth is basically a manager because you now have this AI that's given to you that can be your IC. And it's a very, very different skill set. As every person that's gone from IC to management knows, it's a very different skill set being a good IC versus being a good manager. And that's the big human resources challenge, I think, of the next few decades is how do we deal with every human now having to be a manager? How do we train humans to like it's not enough if you make a good PowerPoint slide or you do good Excel analysis or you write a good document. Now it's you have to edit someone else's work, and that's not easy. It's a very, very different skill set, and I think this is the third piece on change management is where I think enterprises should be spending a lot of time on. You need to reskill your entire workforce given that this is the future wave that's coming.
Thank you very much, Sid. I think there's a rare combination of tech acumen and the consulting background that you carry. I think this rare combination is speaking out loud, and I'm sure the listeners of this podcast would have got a lot of insights from both business as well as the tech background that you carry. Thank you very much, Sid.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sid and JP. I think it has been quite intriguing conversation and grateful for your time and sharing your expertise on podcast today. Before we wind up, do you want to conclude with some final thoughts, JP and Sid?
I'm really excited about the future. I've been in this space for quite some time now, and this year has been special. I'm very optimistic about the next year with people like Sid solving a lot of industry wide problems around hallucination. I'm confident, and I'm going to bet one more year of my life in this space, which is really promising. That's how I would look at this space.
I absolutely second that, JP. I think we're living through some of the most exciting times since the beginning of mankind. I'd say this is like, I mean, to put in perspective, of course, I'm a huge technophile in this sense, but this to me is like the invention of fire, right? Like you have this crazy technology that we've invented. You can imagine like whatever early humans kind of standing around this thing and looking at it and going, wow, this is cool. It gives us warmth. And maybe we can like, I don't know, like roast some meat on it or whatever else people did back then. And if you think about like the journey that fire has had over time and how it's transformed our lives, I feel like this is one of those instances where it is really, really transformational, but it's double edged. Like anything else, like any other piece of technology, it can be used for the wrong things. It can be misused. It can lead to a lot of like destruction and devastation if it's not like carefully kind of thought of. So it's this kind of combination of I'm really excited for the future as a technologist. And I think this is going to be a very, very exciting time. I also feel like we need to get our act together as governments and as a civic society as large to make sure that we mitigate the impact of the negative side effects of some of these things and how they can happen. You're already seeing protests from artists saying that their data is kind of like being taken for training and what does it mean to kind of live in that world. But I think there's even deeper and like lots of other problems like this that will tend to happen over the next few years if you're not careful. But given that I'm a technologist at heart, I feel like yes, technology can be used for good. We just have to make sure that we put the right guardrails in place and make sure we see that vision for a very bright future.
Thank you, Sid and JB. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to you who took us through a fascinating journey from Y2K euphoria to the current hype of AI and also gave us insights into what to expect in AI landscape in next few years. It's definitely been an enlightening and thought provoking conversation. With that, we conclude today's podcast. Thank you for viewing. Stay curious, stay inspired, and stay tuned for more exciting discussions ahead.